without further ado, we're delighted to have Professor David Healy with us today. David's worked on serotonin reuptake systems for 40 years. He's a member of the risk team that organizes and collects reports on treatment-induced adverse reactions. And when David's speaking, I'll post some links in the chat so you know how to find him. David's a regular contributor to Mad in America, and we're delighted that he's chosen to be with us today. And I believe there'll be a follow-up to today's talk. Is that right, David?
That's right. It's in 4 weeks' time.
Great.
And I'm going to mention it during the course of this talk.
Great. Thank you.
Yeah.
So do keep an eye on madinamerica.com for the date of that. And we'll be sharing that in our newsletter as well. So I think that's all the bits and pieces from me. So welcome all. Thank you so much for joining us. And I'm going to hand over to David now to start his talk.
Right. It's good to be here, and it's great to have been asked by Bob to come and to get involved in this conversation. And first of all, before I begin, I would just want to give best wishes to Bob for the situation that he's been having to handle during the day earlier on today. Now, what the cartoon's showing you here is that about 40 years ago or whatever, I'd been reading too much Freud. Now, one of the problems when you read a lot of Freud is you end up being unsure whether you're sane or insane, where the boundary lies between being mad and being normal. It's almost as though he thought we were all crazy. So I did what might sound like an odd thing, was I took a detour from a medical job into a pharmacology lab. Now, this wasn't to investigate treating mental illnesses or making people sane with pills. It was much more a case of figuring these new pills we had might be a way to probe how the mind fits into the brain. And I have to say, I got lucky because the lab that I went to and what I ended up doing was looking at serotonin reuptake in people who were depressed. And this was before the SSRI group of drugs came on the market. This is the first of those drugs, and Prozac was about the fifth. Now, SSRIs helped me work out where the boundary is between being sane and insane. When I say that, what I mean is the reports of the people listening in here and people reporting to risk.org and all the people that I've met who've been on the meds over the year, it's your reports that help me work out what's normal and what's not normal. So this talk that you're going to hear, this conversation we're going to have, is based on the reports, the material that I've heard you give me and give all of us. There's going to be no other expertise other than your expertise in here. My role in all this is to provide the cartoons and the odd weak joke or two. Now, when the pharmaceutical industry realized that they had a doctor working in a pharmacology lab on serotonin reuptake, they thought when the drugs did come out that he'd be the perfect person to educate other doctors about this new group of drugs. Now, it was an educational experience for me. I learned that the pharmaceutical industry figure that no doctors have a thought in their head that isn't put there by them or one of their competitors. When I was seen to work in a lab and to have links to the industry, some of the bigger names in the field, like Arvid Carlsson, who won a Nobel Prize and who was the man who created the SSRI concept and the first SSRI, were happy to be interviewed by me. And Carlsson was particularly interesting. He was prepared to say, look, there's people like me who got a new gadget and we were able to see where drugs went. And when we said, look, we've just seen this or that, people said, gosh, that's brilliant. But everybody listening to this talk could have done the same kind of thing if they'd been the first to get the gadget. These were gadgets which showed where drugs go. Carlsson also had a gadget which showed what drugs do. And that gadget was you. And you're going to play this role through the whole conversation. Listening to people who have been on the older antidepressants, he said some of them were saying on some of these drugs they get more serene. And he noted that it was the drugs that had serotonin reuptake inhibiting properties that led to people saying, I'm feeling more serene in some way. So he said, let's try and make a pure serotonergic drug. And that's where the SSRIs come from. And that's what I was trying to say in this article here 34 years ago, which was, there's nothing wrong with the serotonin system in people who are depressed. That these drugs act on a normal serotonin system to create a serenic or anxiolytic effect. That the industry would have loved to market them as anxiolytics, but because we had a benzodiazepine crisis going on, no doctors were going to believe that a drug to treat anxiety wouldn't also cause you to be hooked, but they would believe that a drug to treat depression wouldn't be likely to cause you to be hooked. So that's why the SSRIs became antidepressants. It's not that they're good antidepressants, they're kind of weak antidepressants. And the other thing is, because of my links to industry, way back in 1992, I was chairing the launch of Zoloft meeting in the UK. And this is the talk I gave, and this is the article to go with it. And I said, serotonin is more primitive than estrogen. And if we've got drugs that work on serotonin, we're going to see things we have never seen before. We need to keep our eyes open. Now, I was saying this to a company who had found Viagra a few years beforehand because things happened in their clinical trials they didn't expect to happen. So in a sense, it was an obvious thing to say, but it was not the message Pfizer wanted you to hear. Their message was, we know all about Zoloft, and the only thing for doctors to do is to prescribe it, and the only thing for patients to do is to take it. And all this was caught in this fabulous cartoon by Michael Leunig, who says, there's this idea that they've created about depression is a simple chemical imbalance in the brain, low serotonin. And the doctor's going to give vitamin serotonin, and everything's going to return to normal, as you see down on the bottom right. The pharmaceutical companies realize that the consumer of drugs is the doctor, it's not you. And the idea of things returning to normal is him feeling good about himself. That's what this cartoon captures so well. Arvid Carlson, when he made the SSRIs, however, figured that they were working on a normal serotonin system. And like LSD, which you see here, this can produce some good effects and some bad effects. He expected the same thing with the SSRIs. There'd be some people that were suited to them and other people who would have a bad reaction. And when people told him that, people become suicidal on your drugs, he said, yeah, I know. He was not surprised, and he didn't argue. And the companies knew all this as well, because they had done healthy volunteer trials during the 1980s, 10 years before the drugs came on the market to be used for patients. And they'd seen that people get vertigo, they got anxious, they got depressed, they became suicidal, they got hooked to these drugs so that they had problems when they tried to come off them. They had terrible sexual problems. And in the withdrawal period in particular, this was a high-risk period for people becoming suicidal. This is Tracy Johnson, who committed suicide during the withdrawal period, and she's not the only one who did. Now, I'm going to put to you that the main effects of the SSRIs are on the body, not the brain. But there is a brain problem that's going to come up through the talk, and it began 400 years ago when René Descartes produced this image here. What had happened just beforehand is we'd found that the heart was a pump. We used to think it was the seat of the soul, but it was a pump, and the body was beginning to look like a machine. So Descartes said, well, there's a ghost, there's a spiritual bit in the machine. It's up there in the pineal gland. And the machine's going to break down and die, but my soul is going to go on forever. Now, he said the evidence for this is, look, when you put your foot too close to the fire, an image of a flame runs up a nerve, as you see there, into the pineal gland, where the soul, the ghost, a bit like an app on your phone these days, looks at it and says, oh, you should take your foot away from that. So taking your foot away is a wise movement. This proved that there was reflection. The soul had been reflecting on things, and this is where the word reflex comes from. And this proves that, there is an intelligence up there in the brain, which led Descartes to say, cogito ergo sum, which is, I think, therefore I am. Now, it took 200 years for us to find out Descartes was wrong, that the pineal gland or the brain isn't involved in reflexes where there's no reflection. They're automatic and unconscious. And for 50 years after that, people began to find almost all our behaviors are controlled by the wisdom of the body. Most of our behavior is automatic and unconscious. And this opened the door to a sentio ergo sum, which is I feel, therefore I am. And the body was, in a sense, no longer a machine. It was a mysterious me that was capable of doing things that we just didn't realize. The people who realized this first were William James and Carl Lange, who independently came up with the idea that, our body is there telling us what's going on in the outside world and what's going on in our inside world. The brain listens to what it hears coming up from the body and often gets things wrong. And you've got feelings coming up from the body. The emotions, the wrong interpretations are often what we call our emotions. Now, 10 years after James and Lange, Freud turns up and says, you guys may not be able to understand what's going on in your body, but I, the expert, can understand. It's a cogito ergo tuus. I, the expert, know what you are. So this is an extraordinary situation where it's hinged on an idea he had called libido. Now, you and I have libido, and we know what it is roughly when we have it. Freud's libido was a much more mystical thing. It's not the libido as you and I understand the word. It wasn't something that could be measured. It was something that changed, depending on whether he was having a bad hair day or not. But based on this, he was able to say, I know what's going on in you more than you know what's going on in you yourself. Now, Freud is dead and he's been replaced by biological psychiatry, or so you think. Biological psychiatry has serotonin, which is exactly like Freud's libido. It's not the serotonin that's in you and me. It's a mystical serotonin. It can't be measured, but based on this, biological psychiatrists seem to think they know more about what's going on in you and me than you and I know. We've replaced a psychobabble with a biobabble. When the first psychotropic drugs came out, people were operating on James Lange kind of approaches, not Freudian. They said drugs are going to act in the body and fool the brain. Like the benzodiazepines, David Healy's giving a talk here and his muscles are awfully relaxed with a benzodiazepine. And the brain looks at this and says, well, he mustn't be anxious because his muscles are relaxed. It's a bit clearer with the beta blocker group of drugs and what happens when you withdraw them. The beta blockers slow your heart rate, they stop you perspiring, they ease the shake in your hand, and the brain looks at this and says, oh gosh, he's giving a talk to this high-powered audience, but there's no signs, there's no indication of the usual signs of being anxious, so he mustn't be anxious. Cardiologists, however, use this drug as well to treat people who've got increased heart rates and raised blood pressure. And they know when they stop the drug for 48 to 72 hours, you're going to have a rebound increase in your heart rate. And the problem is you might think you're anxious when you're not. The brain is going to get it wrong again. So they warn you, you're not anxious. Don't worry about this. Don't seek treatment. It'll ease off pretty quickly. Now, the beta blockers led me to one other interesting lesson, which was way back in a pharmacology practical. I had to give a beta blocker to one of my colleagues, and all the books say one of the most solid findings in all of medicine is beta blockers slow your heart rate. 15 to 20 minutes after she'd had the drug, she was saying, look, I'm feeling anxious. And we checked her heart rate and it was increased. So I'm Irish and she was Irish. The code for the United States is USA. The code for the UK is UK. The code for Ireland is IRL, which is also the code for in real life. So the lesson was, what's happening in real life is what's happening right in front of you. What's in books may be helpful, but it's not real. Now, before we check to see how the SSRIs fit into fooling the brain, let me bring T-Rex into the frame. You see, he's got this enormous head, but just look above his eyes, there's almost no brain there at all. He's got a bird brain. And over on the right, you can see what's going on here. That's the human brain. The pink stuff is the cortex, and the ghost is in there wherever. The whitish bit coming up is the top of the spinal cord, and that's essentially what T-Rex's brain is. There's a bit more to it than that, but not much. The blue dot is where the norepinephrine in T-Rex and you and me is. The green dot is where the serotonin is. Now, I'd like to say the top of the spinal cord is part of the body, not part of the brain. And if that's the case, then 100% of the serotonin in you and me is in our body, not our brain. If you insist the top of the spinal cord is part of the brain, then 5% of the serotonin in you and me is in our brains and 95% in our bodies. So that sets up the following experiment. This is a unit I was working in 25 years ago, and we thought we'd do an experiment to check and see were James Lange right and was Carlson right. We took a bunch of medical and nursing staff and put them on an SSRI or a non-SSRI. They didn't know which they were on. And we got them to let us know how they were feeling on this and trying to pick out if there was a serenic effect, as Arvid Carlson had said there would be. And it turns out absolutely he was 100% right. Well, 100% right in a curious sense, which was 18 out of the 20 were reporting a serenic effect. And 2 out of the 20 got suicidal, so they weren't at all serene. The James Lange bit, the answers to that were provided by the patients, none of whom knew any of, at the medical staff or nursing staff that they knew well, were on any drugs at all. But after 24 to 48 hours, people were coming up to me and asking me, is that doctor on a drug? And I'd say, yes. And they said, is he on an SSRI? And I'd say, yes. How did you know? And they said, well, you can tell by his face and his body language and things like that. And listening to the patients actually describe this, I was left thinking that none of the staff, when we put people on drugs, can notice this kind of thing or can tell what drugs they're on. Primed by my patients, I now look at people when I meet them and can tell, usually pretty accurately, within 2 or 3 minutes, who's on an SSRI and who isn't. It shows in the body language and the facial expressions. You can almost smell it. Now, one of the points this brings out is the motivation of you guys listening to this talk, particularly those of you who've been on SSRIs, is worth more than the clinical expertise of the people you might go along to for treatment. You need to bear that in mind. It shouldn't have come as a surprise. This is a brain scan version of what you've just heard me say, which is over on the left-hand side, you've got a normal brain from a bunch of people, and these are all about to be given one dose of an SSRI and then brain scanned a few hours later, and that's the brain scan on the right. And this leads the researchers to say, hey, look, the SSRI turns the brain off. That's not what's happening. The SSRIs turn the sensory system in the body off. They turn your feelings down, and your brain starts thinking, oh, this is a less emotional situation. It becomes less reactive. It's the brain being fooled effect again. Now, again, as I say, this shouldn't have been a big surprise. Charles Schutz, who wrote the Peanuts cartoons, 30 years ago had a cartoon showing that Lucy knew exactly what Prozac did, the emotional numbing it causes. She whips the ball off Charlie Brown, as she usually does, and she finds that he's not reacting. And her response is, I hate Prozac. So there's a curious effect here, which is our left hand has known something about what these drugs are doing the whole time, and our right hand has no idea about it. So when we took people off beta blockers, it became much more clear what they were doing. And what we're going to do now is take people off some SSRIs. But before we do, I want to point this out to you. Way back when the drugs come out first, we were all blue dots. That is, no one had been on them before and nobody was on them for a long time. But within 3 years of the drugs coming out, most of us were on these drugs had become red dots. That is, we were on them chronically. 3 years after these drugs came out in the UK, GlaxoSmithKline had more reports of dependence on paroxetine than the British regulator had during the previous 20 years for all benzodiazepines combined. 10 years after the SSRIs were on the market, almost all of us who are on them have become red dots. That is, we're on them chronically. Now that 15% of the population in most Western countries is on them, we have a public health crisis. The company response is, well, this isn't our drug causing this problem. We did randomized controlled trials. And even when we put people through cold turkey, very few people had a serious problem. They had mild to moderate problems. And companies can make that claim because they've got two escape routes. If you let them say the anxiety symptoms and depressive symptoms people show when they stop the drug is the original illness coming back, then, they're able to make these arguments. But healthy volunteers who are only on these drugs for 2 weeks, when they stopped the drug, became anxious and depressed, and they'd never been anxious and depressed before in their lives. So that's an escape route that we need to block. The second escape route is, back when we were all blue dots and the companies were doing their original trials, nobody had been exposed to these drugs before. They had no expectation they were going to have a problem, and a lot of people got off without much of a problem. Recently, there have been a number of trials run where people have claimed that people can get off these drugs without too much problem. But in actual fact, most of us are now red dots, and most red dots, when you miss a dose, become suicidal. And the last thing you're going to do, for most red dots, is enter a trial where you're going to have your drugs stopped. So what you get in the trials done today is people who are healthy SSRI takers. They've no reason to believe they're going to have a problem. They've missed doses before. They haven't had a problem. And what do you know? The trial shows that there's no big problem coming off SSRIs. That's because we can no longer randomize people. It will be just simply unethical to do. I told you when they did the healthy volunteer trials, the companies were primed as to what the problems were going to be. And by 1995, they had begun to wheel psychiatrists out to say, these drugs are not addictive. You don't get hooked to them. It's wrong to use words like dependence and withdrawal. Use the word discontinuation syndrome instead. And that's the kind of thing that has been going on ever since. Now, in terms of the problems you can have, I'm beginning here with your skin problems and your gut problems. Your skin and the lining of your gut is the lining of your gut is outside you. It's not inside you. It's continuous with your skin. And most of the serotonin in you and me is in the blood supply and the nerves to the lining of our gut and our skin. That's the boundary between us and the world. That's the place where we encounter our inner world and outer world most. And there's a lot of activity going on there trying to let us know what's going on. Even so, you'd figure if I was talking about an antihistamine, it would make sense to talk about skin problems and gut problems. But, all the SSRIs are antihistamines. They come from antihistamines, and many of the antihistamines many of the over-the-counter antihistamines are SSRIs also. So it's not at all surprising that we've got serious skin problems and gut problems on these drugs. And if you go on to risk.org, we've got blog posts about all this. There's going to be a text version of this talk, which will give you links to some of the blog posts about skin problems and hair problems. So if you want to ask me about hair, I've got a great story to tell people at the end. There's an old joke that explains all this, which is, when a man's boundary increases by a little bit. When its surface area increases by a bit, obviously the blood supply has to go to support that, and the serotonin goes with it. And the old joke that 50% of the population know well, which is when this happens, there isn't enough blood and serotonin left to go to his brain. This looks much more like a brain problem. This is what got called electric zaps or brain zaps or electric head. And it was a shock-like sensation, usually coming from your head downwards, when people tried to stop SSRIs. The interesting thing now is if you go on the web and try and work out what's going on here, what do we know about this, you'll find that a lot of the websites say, well, no one's been doing any research on it and nobody mentions anything about it because we don't want to deter you from taking your pills. We don't want you to think there could be a withdrawal problem. When you dig a bit deeper and go into it, you find this does happen, and it's not a brain problem. It's linked to the skin of your scalp and head and things like that, but it's triggered in particular by you moving your eyes from side to side. So it's not a brain problem. This too is a body problem. Now, when I talked about moving your eyes from side to side, 150 years ago in Germany, 3 different doctors were faced with 3 different patients who said, when I go into a crowded marketplace, I have an I'm going to die experience, and I can't go there anymore, which is what gave this condition its name, agoraphobia. One of the doctors said, look, there's a visual processing issue here. The other doctor said, there's a neurological problem here. We didn't know what it was. We didn't know how to treat it until about 50 years later when behavior therapy comes along and people begin to realize you need to expose people to what they've been avoiding, and that won't necessarily totally cure the problem, but it does help you handle it a lot better. 100 years afterwards, Don Klein in the 1970s said, hey, stop this avoidance therapy stuff. Let's get back to the I'm going to die moment, which he called a panic attack. We need to understand this. Well, he didn't, and we continue to treat panic attacks with a behavioral approach that these days is called interoceptive therapy. And the most recent version of this, which one of the people reporting to risk, who had a protracted withdrawal syndrome, at least she thought she had and we thought she had, one day she said to us, look, I think I've got PPPD. It's a better fit. What's PPPD? Well, it's persistent postural perceptual dizziness. Dizziness is too mild a word for what happens. Vertigo is a much better word. And imagine you're up there on a tightrope and you get a vertigo attack. You're going to have an I'm going to die experience, and you're not going to go up on a tightrope again. Where does balance and the disturbances of balance come from? Well, the key 3 things are your eyes, your inner ear, are the vestibules of your inner ear, and a bunch of sensory receptors in your bones and joints and muscles and skin. These combine together to give you your balance. They've all got serotonin input. Mess with the serotonin and you're going to be unbalanced. And that's where the problem's coming from to some extent. The creators of PPPD don't think that going on an SSRI can cause the problem, although in risk, we've got reports of people having exactly that problem when they go on an SSRI. But the PPPD creators say, yes, sure, coming off an SSRI can cause this. And it's not about tapering. It's nothing to do with the speed of tapering or anything like that. Just the intense vertigo can cause this problem, which can last for the rest of your life. Now, there's a vestibular rehabilitation therapy, which is exactly like behavior therapy, or interoceptive therapy. It helps you manage it, and it's about trying to expose you to the scenes or the kind of situations that can make you dizzy or get vertigo. And that helps a lot, but there's waiting lists for it. And in the interim, because you're anxious and people start thinking it's all in your mind, they refer you along to trauma therapy, figuring, you're anxious because of something awful that happened in your past. Or else, even when your problem has started after stopping an SSRI, they say SSRIs are the cure for this. You need to go on an SSRI, which is a disaster. One of the other risk reporters we've had recently told us about visual vertigo, which is very closely related to all this and very closely related to agoraphobia. And he said, you know, there is a treatment for this that can be helpful called acetazolamide. And you're going to hear about that. Linked into PPPD, a year or two before that, a different condition was put on the map called visual snow syndrome. On Risk, we had a post about visual snow syndrome before anyone created the condition. And the person whose post it is, had that condition for 10 years at this time. Going back to the 1960s, that's when this problem began happening. And it was linked to the older drugs that were serotonin reuptake inhibitors. Now, over on the left-hand side, you see a fabulous painting by Nikki McQueen called Juggling Act, and she just happens to have an eyeball in there. That's why I asked her, could I have a copy of the image? And what handling our bodies is all about is juggling. And this takes effort. And the last thing you want to do is to be on pills of any sort if you're trying to juggle. You get used to doing these things without pills. Once you get put in a pill, you can disturb the balance. The other last thing you want is to get your brain involved in trying to help you put things right if the juggling goes wrong. Visual snow syndrome contains all these problems here. Let me quickly show you them. There's a normal view, and that's what that view looks like with visual snow. Up in the upper left, you see after images of a banana. That's another problem that happens with visual snow syndrome. Down on the bottom right, you see night blindness. If your job depends on driving a car at night, or even your social life depends on driving a car at night, visual snow syndrome is a disaster. We all get what are called floaters from time to time, and usually an ophthalmologist looking in our eyes can spot the floater. But people with visual snow get tons of floaters, as you see here. And when ophthalmologists look in their eyes, they can't spot anything. Now, I'm not going to go into the one at the bottom left. That's on the Risk post that goes with this talk, and it'll explain all about it. But it's something, again, that ophthalmologists can't see that you can see. And because they're things that they can't see, that you can see, they figure it's not in your eyes, it's in your mind. And they're very comfortable saying these days that you've got a functional neurological disorder. Functional neurological disorder is code for hysteria. It's a kiss of death for anyone who wants to be taken seriously. It's a thing that ophthalmologists and neuro-otologists and all sorts of ologists these days turn to when faced with drug toxicity. It's because we've got an increasing number of partialists who know more and more about less and less. And when something turns up that's linked to a drug that they don't normally use, that they know nothing about, they're inclined to blame you and think it's all in your head when it's not. This is telling us things about vision that they don't know about and they don't really want to hear about. The other point I should make here is that, again, VSS is not linked to the speed at which you taper, and it may start after you come off the drug and may last for the rest of your life. Now, here's probably the most important problem. One of these two people is on or was on an SSRI. When you go on an SSRI, the first thing that happens to you within 30 minutes of your first pill is you become genitally numb. And this can happen on 1 or 2 milligrams of Prozac, not 20 milligrams. Just a tiny dose will cause your genitals to feel like you've rubbed lidocaine into them. You expect it's all going to clear up when you halt the drugs, but it can get much worse when you halt the drug. It's not linked to the speed of tapering, and it can last for the rest of your life. Nobody's told about this before they go on the drug. Nobody's partner who's going to be affected as well is told about this. If you're a male, you're not told that your sperm count will go through the floor, and this is not happening because of the serotonergic effect of these drugs. If you're a woman, you're not told that you may not be able to carry a pregnancy as successfully as you would otherwise have done so. This means that we've fallen below the reproductive replacement rate, and all Western countries now need immigrants. Without immigrants, the social structures are going to collapse. But this isn't, there should be a national conversation about this, but it's not going to come up in the debate next Tuesday night. You can be sure of that. We've known about all this for a long time. We began knowing about it during the 1960s. In the 1970s, we were using the serotonergic effect of these drugs to treat premature ejaculation problems. By the 1980s, we knew that some people coming off serotonergic reuptake inhibitors could have enduring sexual dysfunction that might last for the rest of their life. In the 1980s, companies were doing healthy volunteer trials where they found that the bitterest problem people had was they just couldn't function from a sexual point of view at all. But people like me running clinical trials for GlaxoSmithKline weren't told this. We were told, in this trial, don't ask about sex, which meant that when they reported the results of the trial, they were able to say less than 5% of people had a sexual dysfunction in our trial. And of course, once you halt the drug, everything will clear up. That wasn't true. None of that was true. They knew you mightn't be able to halt the drug. They knew you may never be able to make love again. And this is, from my point of view, one of the most remarkable things, one of the most remarkable documents, I guess, about healthcare, modern healthcare, that you're ever likely to be able to get access to. It's three guys, just normal guys with no background in healthcare at all, talking about their PSSD. They're linked to the PSSD network, and they're explaining, they've come out and given their names and explaining to people just what goes on when you get PSSD. This is much better than anything else you can read, any experts on healthcare anywhere. And it's just people like you listening in who are saying, Bryn is saying, you know, getting PSSD undermines your faith in medicine and science. And it's not just the fact that you've got it, it's the fact that you go to a doctor, and it's a bit like you go to a doctor and your arm has been chopped off, and you say, Doctor, I've lost an arm. And he looks at you and says, well, you look perfectly normal to me. You know, you look like you've got the right number of arms. This is the response that people get when they have this problem is simply unbelievable. They've got a very clear problem. They talk about it to the doctor and they get brushed aside. And Roy is saying, and it's not just that you can't make love, it's you have no emotions. And what he's talking about here is your sense of touch, generally, not just genitally, around the body is reduced. You have less feelings. And of course, the brain reads less feelings as less emotions. You're emotionally numb. These two things correlate very closely. And Bryn says one of the obvious things, which is, you know, nobody's going to believe us because everybody's going to say, well, if a drug caused something like this, FDA wouldn't have let it on the market. Now, Bruce Springsteen has also been on the drugs, like many of you here. Unfortunately, he isn't on the call, but you know, I was hoping to show you a picture of Bruce on his paddleboard out in the ocean, blue skies. There's tons of photographs of him on the paddleboard because that's his happy spot. But they're all copyrights, so I was a bit nervous about using them. Instead, you're seeing Bruce's book, where he describes at one point, you know, he's out on the paddleboard in his happy spot. It's a glorious day, nothing wrong, and he bursts out into tears. So when he gets in, he calls his doctor, says, oh, no problem, no problem. Just take a sliver of one of the old SSRI pills you have and everything will be just fine. And it is. We've known about this since the 1960s. Just a teeny dose of a serotonin reuptake inhibiting older antidepressant or whatever can sort this problem out. We've known that this happens and we know how to handle it. In the book, Bruce goes on to give one of the best descriptions of akathisia there is. It's a 2 or 3 page bit of the book. It's wonderful. So I've just picked out a little bit. And I'm really just going to pick out the bit at the end there, where he says there was no life here, just an endless, irritating, existential angst embedded in my bones. He doesn't say in my brain, he says in my bones, and that's probably right. And he was demanding answers that I did not have. He's hinting in the whole piece that he can easily see how people go on to commit suicide. So the minute he gets a chance to call his doctor, he calls the doctor and explains what things are like. And the doctor doesn't say, take a bit of an SSRI, just a little dose, because that will make things much worse. And the dose will get put up and up and up. The point I'm trying to make is he's got two different problems, and there's two different answers here. Bruce hints at the fact that this can make you suicidal, and indeed it can. If we look at the trials that brought these SSRIs on the market, you see that over on the left-hand side under the word screening, what the companies have had to do is whip people off the prior drugs that they were on. And this 1 or 2 week phase is the most dangerous phase at the trial, where there are most likely to be suicidal events. What the companies did, however, was to say, well, these people were on no drugs at all, which is the same as being on placebo. So let's put those suicidal events under the heading of placebo. This breaches FDA regulations. It looks like fraud, but you can't call it fraud because the companies say FDA saw exactly what we did and they didn't object. This is study 329, where over on the right-hand side, you see this very tall black column, which is the kids on paroxetine who have been tapered off it. And you see the rate of suicidal events or serious behavioral events is very high compared to the rate on imipramine, which is also a serotonin reuptake inhibitor. That's the white column. And compared to the hashed column, which is placebo, you see that, when people say coming off my SSRI isn't a good idea, that these drugs save my life, this is what a lot of people are talking about. Now, here's a risk heroine who deserves a Nobel Prize as much as Arvid Carlson did. She had no background in healthcare. She'd done nothing to do with science anywhere. She dropped out of school at the age of 16. She ends up getting put on an SSRI, and she figures it's made her alcoholic. And, AA pay no heed to her, doctor pays no heed to her. She begins to go on the internet and work out just what's going on, learn about the serotonin system, and works out how the drugs could make someone like her alcoholic. Her research is now embodied in the Canadian guidelines for alcohol use disorder. And we've begun to recognize that, it isn't just the SSRIs that are driving people to drink, or other, we're driving with the drugs we use, we're driving people to take other drugs to try and cope with the problems that our drugs cause. Now, there's probably a few ways in which SSRIs can increase your alcohol consumption, but one of them is because alcohol is a tremendous treatment for akathisia. It's like, I hope I mentioned that Bruce's doctor said to him, take clonazepam, and that cured his akathisia. Alcohol is very like clonazepam. And the companies used benzodiazepines like that in the clinical trials they did to mask the problem. So we are driving people to drink. Anne-Marie ended up, I've got a PhD in the serotonin system. She was able to tell me things about the serotonin system that I didn't know. And that's true of all of you listening in here. You don't want to think there are researchers who know how to do research. When you've got skin in the game, you guys do better research than the rest of us do. Now, this is probably the most important slide in the talk. And what it shows you is that actually no one should ever have been put on much more than 5 to 10 milligrams of Prozac. What it shows you is that at low doses, drugs like an SSRI occupy the serotonin reuptake sites almost completely. Once you start going up to a 20 milligram dose, you're not gaining anything. This is true for the anticholinergic drugs and the beta blockers and the serotonin reuptake inhibitors and norepinephrine reuptake inhibitors and other drugs. Lilly had trials showing that 5 milligrams of Prozac was as good as a 20 milligram dose. So why did they use 20 milligrams? Well, because it was so hard to prove to FDA, they actually got a little help from FDA to get the drug through, but it's very hard to try and get the drug through FDA as an antidepressant. And that's why they were taking no chances and giving you a toxic dose. The point I'm making here is that almost no one was on anything but a toxic dose of all of the SSRIs when they came out. You could have been on a much lower dose, and we may well have had much less problems. These drugs do all sorts of things, acting on P63, regulatory proteins, carbonic anhydrase enzymes, and all sorts of other things once the dose goes up. And doctors, of course, looked at the 20 milligram dose and thought, this is a low dose. Why don't we put it up to 40 and 60 and 80 milligrams? A lot of the problems we're dealing with is the fact that you are being poisoned right from the very start. No one was able to get away with not being poisoned. Now, this is the kind of graph that is also used to illustrate the point that tapering can be helpful, in particular hyperbolic tapering. You know, you see that a little dose of the drug has a big effect and higher doses have much less. And the argument is that coming back down produces the same thing. It doesn't. If it did, then the anticholinergics and the norepinephrine reuptake inhibitors and the beta blockers and almost every drug you care to think of would cause serious problems getting off them the way the SSRIs do. And they don't. Beta blockers, you know, give you anticholinergic drugs give you a problem for 48 to 72 hours. SSRIs give you a problem for 48 to 72 weeks or 48 to 72 months. Now, there is a problem with SSRIs that isn't talked about, which is these are orthosteric drugs, and the anticholinergics, for instance, are what we call allosteric drugs. I'm not going to explain that here now, but if anyone wants to ask me about it later, I'll be happy to explain it. The other thing is this graph doesn't leave a place for opioids or alcohol. You know, we don't invoke a graph like this when we're talking about getting off opioids and alcohol, which we can get people off quite easily. It also leaves no place for an antidote. The fact that Bruce could have two different kinds of problems, one of which needs a little sliver of an SSRI, another of which needs a benzodiazepine or alcohol. And I've said to you that there are issues like, there are drugs like acetazolamide. I forgot to mention that visual snow problems, there's some of those that actually seem to respond to it as well. So there's antidotes that, you know, to some extent, there's a bias against antidotes, and it may be that, you know, an antidote isn't a bad idea for some of us. The other thing is that the graph is on the left is a company graph, and it plays usual company tricks. You know, the X and the Y axis aren't equivalent. When you make them equivalent, you can change the graph so it looks like the one on the right, which looks much less intimidating than the one on the left. Now, the companies had this wonderful myth, which is low serotonin, which got people on the drugs. Hyperbolic tapering, to some extent, is an excellent myth also. It persuades people to try coming off, which is a great thing. Many people can get off. It suggests the science. We know what we're doing. We know the science. We know how to get you off, which does tempt people into trying, which is a good thing. The problem is it's as mythic as the low serotonin myth. And the extra problem is the companies have looked at this myth and said, hey, we think that's a good myth. And they're using it to say, look, there's no problem getting off our drugs. You just need to taper properly. The other thing that happens is when people are told the science shows you can get off if you do it slowly, and they can't get off, or things just don't work out the way the science appears to say, they end up being gaslit. They get dismissed. Companies and doctors say, well, that's your fault if you can't get off them. It is easy. We know how to do it. And if you're failing, that's something wrong with you. So the ghost in the machine is where is the bit of us that companies program to get us to think the way they want us to think, both doctors and patients. Now, this is a cartoon from 50 years ago, so it's very prescient. This looks like a I've always thought this looked like a painful operation, but doctors are very happy with the outcome. as you'll see. They feel just wonderful afterwards. They're told, I'm doing precision psychiatry. Can you imagine that? That's just absolutely wonderful. Precision psychiatry looks a bit like this. It's about magic bullets, that I, the doctor, am going to be able to fire a bullet that will go exactly to the place that it needs to go and will sort out the enemy, kill them stone dead without killing any bystanders or whatever, and I'll get out without any problems. That's magic bullet or precision psychiatry type thinking. When Arvid Carlson made SSRIs, he didn't think they were magic bullets. He thought they were therapeutic principles. That's his word. What's a therapeutic principle? Well, here's constipation. And there's 4 different kinds of constipation. And there's 4 different kinds of laxative. Get the right laxative for the constipation you had, and your mother and people like that 50 years ago or more was good at being able to recognize what it was you needed. And doctors, to some extent, were too. Get the wrong laxative, and you risk getting treatment-resistant constipation. The problem we've got is when a company gets a license from FDA to claim their drugs a laxative, their interest is to get everyone who's got constipation on their drug. They're not interested in their drug being used just for the right kind of constipation. And this creates treatment-resistant constipation. When Arvid Carlson created an SSRI, he said it's a serenic principle that's going to suit some people and not others. If you put people that it doesn't suit on SSRIs, you're going to create treatment-resistant depression. Treatment-resistant depression is another word for protracted withdrawal syndrome, and an increasing number of people like Anik Lemons, whom you see here, who featured in MAD in America earlier on this year, have opted for euthanasia. Anik was told that, you've got a broken brain and we can't fix it. If you look at what she was actually saying was wrong, was really annoying her, she was talking about a sensory problem, a hearing problem, and it may well be that there are things we could do now to fix that, but she's unfortunately dead, and an increasing number of people faced with the problems of coming off SSRIs are opting for this approach. Now, let me show you. This is a complex wiring system. And a while ago, I had a patient with OCD who had a job sorting these kind of systems out. And if you've got OCD, figuring whether you've put the right wire back in the right place is a total nightmare. So he came along to me for help. I liked him a lot. So we did all the best things. We put him on the first line treatment, which is an SSRI. We increased the dose. We did all the things that you might do. And we made him worse. So he kind of came back to me a few weeks later and was much better. And he told me he'd stopped all of my drugs and he'd taken up smoking. But before he took up smoking, he'd researched nicotine and said, do you know, there's a lot of studies showing that nicotine is good for OCD, which I didn't know. And he produced a bunch of articles and handed them over to me. And the curious thing was the top article in the bunch had an author on it whose name I knew. It was Arvid Carlson. His SSRIs are now the #1 treatment for OCD, but he had recognized that not everybody with OCD responds to an SSRI. And some of the people who didn't respond said, but, when they go back on nicotine, it's great. So he ran a trial and said, absolutely, yes, there's a bunch of people for whom nicotine is a much better treatment for OCD than SSRIs are. It's a better therapeutic principle for them. And if this is true for OCD, it's true for a lot of anxiety states and what we call depression states also. The point I want to make to you, though, is my patient is the only person in a good position to make a risk-benefit call. He knows what SSRIs did from nothing, made him worse. He knows what nicotine did from actually made him feel a lot better. He knows the hazards of nicotine. If you take it every day for the rest of your life, it may shorten your life. SSRIs every day for the rest of your life, particularly when we throw in other drugs into the mix, are also going to shorten your life, probably more so than nicotine. So he's the only person, not me, not anyone else, not the books. He's the only person who's able to make an in real life call about what he should do. So now, let's see, can we help you get off these drugs? And what we're doing is essentially managing a drug dysregulation syndrome. I need to mention here first that when we dysregulate things, tapering is the right thing to do. Way back, we've got people like Bob Fitterman saying we need liquids. We've recently had Peter Groot talking about tapering strips. We've had Adele Framer and Mark Horowitz and David Taylor talk about hyperbolic tapering. And, provided you take it to mean tapering slowly, then this is absolutely the right way forward. We've got people like Angie Peacock tuned in here and James Moore, who these are my heroes. I think they're heroic because of their lived experience, but lived experience are two words that are very tame for being able to remain sane in the midst of the problems getting off these drugs can cause. Not just remain sane, but keen and interested to reach out and help others. What I think is happening is we've got a set of dysregulation syndromes around the body, and tapering is definitely the correct way forward. There will be some people who can go cold turkey, but all things being equal, it makes sense to go at your pace, and things like tapering strips can make a big difference to your ability to do so. You need to recognize, however, that people from Joe Biden to the Pope, the powers that be across the board, do not want you to come off your good meds. They want you on as many good meds as you can be on. They don't want you on the bad meds, but they're in the business of deterring you from hearing about the harms of the good meds. The other problem we've got that I've mentioned is partialism. Doctors who know more and more about less and less and brand drug harms as a mental problem, your mental problem. Another problem is the medical literature about these drugs at the moment is totally ghostwritten, and the lying in the literature is out of control. The evidence base that doctors look to is literally pretty fraudulent. The other big problem we've got is that we've got a kind of model for getting off opioids and alcohol. Everybody knows roughly how long it's going to take and the kinds of things that are going to be done. We do not have a model for getting off SSRIs. We need something like a complex chemical imbalance model. And the other thing to come back to is the brain problem, which I'm going to pick up first. The fluoroquinolone group of antibiotics, which you see down below there, are among the most toxic drugs you can possibly get. If at all possible, avoid them. They have been the number one antibiotic in the United States. I would have to be on my deathbed before I'd accept taking one. These things cause serious physical problems right around the body. And in terms of trying to manage all this, the brain says, you're anxious and depressed and confused and paranoid. The brain makes multiple mistakes. The problem is that the doctor who gave you the fluoroquinolone hears you say that you're anxious and depressed and says, oh, that's a mental problem. We need to get a shrink. The same thing happened with COVID. We called in the shrinks. Same thing happened with vaccine harms. We called in the shrinks who dump SSRIs into the mix, causing SSRI toxicity. They made things worse. Even if you're talking about SSRI toxicity, shrinks treated with SSRIs, the last thing you want on this earth, if you've got a drug-induced toxicity of any sort, the last thing you want to see coming towards you is a psychiatrist. On the other hand, there's a bunch of women who have an I'm going to die experience. And unlike PPPD and all these panic attacks and things like that, they handle it quite well, partly because they have a context, they have a model, they know what's going on, they know this can go on for the next few months or a few years, they know it's not going to kill them, they know it's going to pass. They're having a hot flash in the menopause. Now here you see a competent professional woman, probably a lawyer, but not just an average lawyer. She might be an attorney general or something. She could even be a leader of the free world. She's looking like this partly because she's in an advert for Brisdell. What's Brisdell? Brisdell is paroxetine for hot flashes. In my experience, women who get put on SSRIs for hot flashes have the worst problems trying to get off. They've got no mental problems to begin with. Try and get them off the SSRI they've been put on, they find a terrible problem. And partly what's going on here looks to me like you've got the dysregulation of the menopause into which you dump a further dysregulation from the SSRI, and that makes things a lot harder. I talked to you about PSSD earlier, this genital numbness. You can also get genital akathisia, which gives rise to persistent genital arousal disorder. And that gives you intense orgasms the whole time that are so unwanted and distressing that women have resorted to a clitoridectomy to handle it. Now, there's a bit of good news perhaps here, which is there's a bunch of drugs which look like they might be helpful, one of which you've heard me mention before called acetazolamide, and I'm going to tell you more about that shortly. But the point I want to make is PGAD happens when you're trying to withdraw from an SSRI and are menopausal, are going through the menopause. So again, you've got this combination of two dysregulations going on. And here, this is PMDD, a terrible illness. 20 years ago, Prozac came off patent and other SSRIs did, and Prozac got rebranded as Sarafam. Was going to be a miracle treatment for PMDD, which was this terribly severe and dangerous form of PMS or PMT. And as the ad kind of suggests, there's a degree of irritability here, and this leads to aggressive and hostile behavior. Now, SSRI, the numbing they cause may, in some instances, be helpful, but in terms of whether it helps aggression and hostility, the answer is no. From the clinical trials done, the rates of aggression and hostility in women on SSRIs for PMDD is much, much higher than in the women not taking an SSRI. Now, if the SSRI doesn't suit you for PMDD, there's a drug that does seem to help. And at this point, you can probably guess what it is. It's called acetazolamide. I'll tell you why I'm laboring all this now in a minute. But what I want to tell you first is this. The symptoms of the menopause map wonderfully onto the symptoms of the dysregulation that coming off SSRIs can cause. You see all the symptoms there on the left-hand side. I've picked out a few. Brain zaps are in both, brain fog is in both, vertigo is in both, fatigue is in both. Osteoporosis, you'll say, well, yes, that's in the menopause, but SSRIs don't cause osteoporosis. Yes, SSRIs do cause osteoporosis. Why does the menopause have so many symptoms? Because estrogen affects every tissue in the body, as do SSRIs and serotonin. What would a menopause type model, the dysregulation model, offer us? Well, it would offer the fact that some women can sail through it without a big problem, and others have a debilitating problem. There may be a genetic component to this. If your mother had difficult menopause, it seems you're more likely to have one too. It tells us that there'll be a bunch of women who have a particular cluster of symptoms and a bunch of other women who have totally different cluster of symptoms. It tells us that antidotes that will work for one set of problems for some women won't work at all for a different set of women. It tells us that this can go on for months, or it can go on for years. It can go on for 3, 4, 5 years. So it maps terribly well onto the serotonin dysregulation. It also offers us something that not even Donald Trump would dare to say to a woman, that this is all in your mind, darling. But a lot of people on SSRIs, not people going through the menopause, but people on SSRIs are absolutely sure they've got a broken brain, and they say, well, I've got brain fog. Problem here is if you're an elite athlete, a tremendous piano player, you find if you go on an SSRI that your piano skills disappear, that your golf swing gets worse, that your gym floor routine breaks down, because the SSRIs can disturb all these things. And when you try and put it right, like the piano playing, when you try and put it right, your brain wants to help, so it concentrates and focuses, and that makes things worse. And the focusing and concentration is effortful, so it tires you out. This is what brain fog is. It's a body problem. What you want, if you want to avoid, I mean, when we do cognitive function tests in people in SSRI withdrawal, you've performed awfully well. And simply looking at the research you guys have been doing on the problems that are happening to you show you that your brain is working normally. It's just your body is not working normally. And the answer to this is to park your brain to one side, as we'll see. As Nikki McQueen's juggling act shows you, juggling just takes brute repetition. If you start thinking about what you're doing, you're going to mess the whole thing up. It's a thing you see with kids. If you don't like the menopausal model, just think children. It takes 2 or 3 years for them to get their body regulated so they can do things. Somewhere around the age of 2 or whatever, you see if you put on a bit of music, they begin to bop to it. They haven't been taught it, but you know, after repeated falling episodes and things like that, they've got to the point where they can stay on their feet and can begin to bop pretty rhythmically to the music. Now, we can build cortical things on that, like opera and ballet and things like that. But if the kid hasn't learned to regulate its body, none of that's going to work. So can we help you? Well, we can do two things. We can mess with your mind and we can poison your body. What you got to recognize is that when we put you on SSRIs, we numb you. Your feelings are numbed. When you start coming off, there's going to be a return of feelings. Now, these don't need to be explored. I'm not saying that these are going to return and you need to explore them, just the opposite. The problem is they're going to feel more intense than you're used to. You're not going to be able to cope with your feelings, not because they're about awful things, but because they're so intense, or feel so intense to you. When we put you on an SSRI, we change your personality, your family, your friends. The patients in the ward where you're a doctor can spot the change in personality. If we stop the SSRI, your personality is going to go back to maybe being a bit more irritable and aggressive or whatever. And lots of people you live with might prefer you to be the way you were on the SSRI. They're going to not help you get off the SSRI. They're going to say, hey, darling, don't you think you should stay on this drug? And you might even feel that way yourself. There are some interoceptive therapies, behavior therapies like vestibular rehabilitation therapy. This works for PPPD. They tried it for visual snow syndrome. I'm not sure it works. PSSD doesn't work at all. So, you know, some of these behavior therapies can be helpful for some of the problems people have, but not all. We've known for 200 years that if you get an infection, a mental illness, or a cancer can clear up. Some tweak to the immune system at times can actually make a difference. But a difference for the better. I had a friend recently who's had protracted withdrawal syndrome for decades, and he recently got in touch and said, look, you know, my problem's cleared up, which is great. He got cancer, was on cancer chemotherapy, and it looks like all of a sudden the protracted withdrawal is gone. I'm not saying you want to get cancer or an infection, just the opposite, in fact, which is you may be doing awfully well trying to taper down off the drugs, and you get an infection or something that hits your immune system, and all of a sudden you're set back. At that point, you don't want a therapist to start looking at past trauma or anything like that. Therapists will be quite likely to say to you, you've got complex PTSD. I'm not sure I think a lot about the concept, except there's one great thing that it does map onto quite well, which is the repeated traumatic episodes people on SSRIs have when they try and go along and tell a doctor what's going on and that they think they need to reduce the dose, and he increases the dose. These are traumatic situations. If you've got a coach or a therapist or help of some sort who is not prepared to go along with you to the doctor and say that they agree with you that this is linked to the drug and that, you know, we need to taper much more slowly than maybe the doctor's proposing, then I don't think, yeah, and if they're talking instead about CPTSD, I don't think you really want that therapist. I think they're going to make things worse. They're not able to solve, they understand less about the problem than you do, and they're not going to be able to solve it for you. One of the problems we have, though, is when we talk about getting off drugs, everybody says you switch over to therapy. And I'm not sure that's the case. Maybe you should switch over to walking or running or climbing or swimming, something that forces your body into a new routine. And ultimately, if you keep walking and running and swimming and whatever, you are going to get the body back regulating itself in a way that sitting down in a chair and talking to a therapist won't. We can poison your body. Now, treasure this moment. You have a doctor saying to you, have you thought about nicotine and alcohol? Nicotine, not because it's a treatment for the withdrawal, but because lots of people who've got problems on SSRI withdrawal shouldn't ever have been on the SSRI to begin with. It was never going to help them. Nicotine would have worked much better. So you need to think about, did it ever really help me to begin with? And if not, then nicotine or other things may be the right thing. We know that alcohol can be a great treatment for the akathisia that these drugs can cause. So, you may want to think in the next 1 or 2 or 3 years, while I have this problem, I'm going to use my tapering strips, but I'm also going to get a good cigar and wine that I like, and I'm going to, use these things to help me through the period. Now, nicotine and alcohol are despised by medicine almost as much as the anticholinergic group of drugs, which you see 3 of them here. And you see the picture on the left, the lady has burning feet. This is a peripheral neuropathy. It's a tremendous problem linked to being on SSRIs and linked to SSRI withdrawal. The only drugs in medicine we have that help peripheral nerves to regenerate are the anticholinergic group of drugs. And what we need to do a bit more thinking of is getting people with withdrawal problems and PSSD and all sorts of things on these drugs, probably for about 6 months in a lowish dose. They're much milder in terms of side effects they have than SSRIs, and to see what elements of the problem they clear up. There's other things like DMSO and P5P. There are risk blog posts about this. The other option is to take a much less potent. The SSRIs are much too potent. If you get a serotonin reuptake inhibitor like an antihistamine like diphenhydramine, which is what Prozac was made from, or nortriptyline or dosulipin, that may be much more helpful than just tapering on its own. And then there's acetazolamide, which helps with visual vertigo and vestibular migraine and visual snow and PGAD and PMDD, etc. And, did you know that SSRIs don't work at altitude? And the reason they don't work at altitude is they're carbonic anhydrase activators, which means they cause fluid to accumulate in bits of your body, and this is what contributes to altitude sickness. Acetazolamide is the treatment for altitude sickness. It's a carbonic anhydrase inhibitor. It reduces fluid. It reduces fluid in your eyeball. SSRIs increase the fluid in your eyeball, give you glaucoma, which can cause you to go blind. Acetazolamide is the treatment for that. So when Bruce talks about it feels like it's in his bones, there's a skin between over the bone, there's a little bit of space where there shouldn't be fluid. And if there's fluid accumulating there on an SSRI, remember they act on the bone, they cause osteoporosis. This may be exactly what's going on. I'm not saying for sure it is, but acetazolamide is the kind of drug which is not a diuretic, but it seems to be good at getting fluid out of places that it shouldn't be. There's a condition SSRIs cause called benign intracranial hypertension, and this has the word benign linked to it, but it can lead to some disastrous outcomes, and it's linked to migraine and things like this. And SSRIs cause it, and acetazolamide is the best treatment. Now, SSRIs also cause sleep apnea. I don't know there's any fluid involved in that, but it turns out acetazolamide is not a bad treatment. Now, I'm not trying to say acetazolamide is a magic bullet. It's not. It's what Carlson would have called a therapeutic principle. It might suit some people. It might suit bits of the problem you have. It's unlikely to treat the whole problem. I don't want people racing out and thinking, hey, I need to get this drug. We need to tackle it cautiously because the top bit of the slide there says we're giving you a poison. There is nothing that's not a poison. They all come with risks. And the issue is, can we bring good out of their use? The key element in all this is you. We've got a scientific problem, which is how to get you off this drug. Your doctor or your coach or your therapist aren't particularly helpful. You are the instrument, the gadget in which the experiment's taking place. You have a unique observation point on what's going on. You are the scientist. Someone like me may have seen a different patient who looks like you and they responded to X, Y, or Z. I need to learn not to say this. We need to look at what works for you. You're the person who knows when you tweak things, just what happens. If you got a doctor or a coach or a therapist or whatever who wants to convert you over to, neuroplasticity or trauma or whatever, that's religion. If they're trying to convert you to something that they believe in, that's religion. That's not science. And what we need at this point is the best possible science we can bring to bear on it. And you must appreciate from what I've been telling you, you guys have been doing marvelous science. You've been the only ones doing science in this area. Which leads me to almost the last slides. We've taken the Loining cartoon in Risk and repurposed it, as you see here, from a depression causes simple chemical imbalance in the brain to antidepressants cause a complex chemical imbalance in the body. And this is what normal looks like now, which is she's absolutely right. 9 times out of 10, her problem is going to clear up in a few weeks without taking any of those little pills. And most doctors, a lot of doctors will be grateful if you take that approach with them. What they should be asking you is to do the research that people like you have been doing in this area, because that makes my job a lot more fun. I end up with 100 free research assistants rather than 100 heart-sink patients that I treat according to the guidelines and who get worse the whole time. So that's what normal should look like, and you guys have taught me this. What does madness look like? Well, I think you can guess. This is what madness looks like. What we've got is a situation where I've been saying to doctors in the United States for 20 years, if the pills work as well as you say and are free of problems, you are out of business. You're going to be replaced by nurses and pharmacists and others who are cheaper prescribers. And increasingly, that's exactly what happens. And this leads me to my last slide. The fact that doctors are gone and been replaced by other prescribers is not necessarily good news. The other prescribers are going to be programmed even more intensely with a mission to get you to conform. And that mission is going to include getting you off older, cheaper drugs like the SSRIs and paying no heed to you when you say that, I'm going to die if you whip me off these drugs in 4 weeks. How can we stand up to this? And the answer is, well, back in 1968, when Arvid Carlson listened to you and decided to make SSRIs, so you helped contribute towards his Nobel Prize, there was revolutions going on from Tokyo to Prague to Paris to Chicago, which was a war zone when the Democratic Party National Convention was happening there. And the protesters, the students and people like that, one of the big gripes, apart from the Vietnam War, was biological psychiatry and the use of drugs which they thought was going to dehumanize us. They wanted to hang on to the ghost in the machine, because this is what gives us our individuality. Well, the ghost in the machine is what churches and states and pharmaceutical companies now increasingly use to program you into conformity. Our individuality lies in our mysterious bodies, which are not a machine, which can be wise. People might call that biological reductionism, but it's not, because our mysterious bodies are part of a mysterious us. And an us that's capable of doing science and finding out what we're made of, what our purpose is here, etc., And a great deal of doing that depends on the individual differences between me and you. If we're all the same, we're not going to learn much. When there's differences between us as individuals, it's about coming to consensus about these experiences, these mysterious feelings and problems we have, the intuitions that our bodies have. That's where the science of finding out who we really are lies. Now, I've celebrated you because you deserve celebrating. You guys have been doing the research on all this, not anyone else. I've talked about some awkward problems the SSRIs cause, but you know, there are darker problems that I haven't talked about. Things that people would use the word evil for, things that people like popes and rabbis and ayatollahs and presidents should be getting involved in trying to work out, because these are some of the critical issues of our day. That's the material that I'm going to be picking up in the talk in 4 weeks' time. And I hope you're going to be part of the conversation, because again, it's being based on things that you've reported on these drugs. One final point. The kind of science I've been talking about enriches all of us. If some company or some profession or some countries getting rich out of drugs, they are not doing science. If it's not enriching all of us, it's not science. Thanks.
Okay, thank you so much, David. As always with your talks, an incredible amount of food for thought and an incredible amount to think about. So, thank you to all of you for your questions. As you can imagine, we've been absolutely inundated. So we'll start to go through some of them. I apologize if we don't get to your question. We'll try and crash through as many as we can. But thank you all for inputting to the chat and submitting questions.
Will I turn off the slides or anything like that, James? And one more quick thing to mention. This talk, the text bit will be up on risk.org probably tomorrow, and people can go back and look through the text and get all of the slides, and there'll be links put into risk posts that deal with particular problems. Okay.
Okay, so let's have a look at the questions. So you mentioned, David, somebody did ask about the difference between, just get the right window up, orthosteric and allosteric. So is it worth
Yeah,
just spending a minute or two on that?
absolutely. Okay, and this can be very quick. There are drugs that bind tightly to the receptor, and they're orthosteric drugs. There are drugs that produce the same kind of changes but don't bind to the receptor. They bind near it, and they're allosteric drugs. And the anticholinergic group of drugs are the allosteric drugs, and they're much gentler. The orthosteric drugs, the risk is if you got a drug that binds too tightly, you don't just block the receptor, you essentially destroy it. And that's what some of the tightly binding SSRIs do. And that's part of the problem we've got. We've got things dysregulated because people have lost receptors. It's not just trying to get the drug to unbind. The receptor's gone, so that's a bit of the problem that we've got with the SSRI group of drugs.
Okay, thank you. And Joanna asked, what do you think about hormone replacement therapy, so estrogen and progesterone? Do you think it could help with withdrawal in perimenopausal women?
Great question, and I don't know the answer. What I do know is there's a lot of women out there who've been through the menopause and things like that. There's a lot of research on it, and they need to do the thinking. They're the ones who know all about this much more than people like me. They need to do the thinking and tell us, does the model that I've outlined for the dysregulation that goes to coming off SSRIs, does that map onto the menopause? And if they come out and say, yes, it does, then I think it points the way forward. And there may be a bunch of strategies women going through the menopause have that, that can be applied to getting off SSRIs as well.
Thank you. And someone's asked, can you explain in more detail the link between antihistamines and SSRIs?
Yeah, sure. A lot of the antihistamines, well, when Carlson began to make the first SSRI, he took an antihistamine and optimized it. fixed it so that it would bind more tightly to the serotonin reuptake site and would have less action on norepinephrine. It was the same thing with Prozac. Lilly took that and first of all made a norepinephrine reuptake inhibitor and then switched over and made Prozac from it. One of the interesting things about all this is that most of these drugs began from dyes, that is, things to color clothes. And one of the things that happens when you go on an SSRI, we've had a bunch of mainly women who report into us, I began an SSRI and I went along to get the usual blonde color in my hair or whatever, and it turned a weird shade of green. Well, you've been taking a dye by mouth and you're getting a dye put in your hair and the two meet in your hair. And when you mix two dyes, you can get a color that's just not what you expect.
Thank you. I was interested myself, and a few people asked a similar question. So, one of the issues that people in my position or many people in the chat is nomenclature. We don't know whether it's a drug injury or a withdrawal injury, or it's very difficult to seize upon a term to talk to our doctors about, because of course if you say I came off 5 years ago and I'm still struggling, the first response you get is that's not the drug, that's something else, it's in your head, or whatever else. So should we then draw a distinction between drug withdrawal and drug damage, and maybe then perhaps we can start to think about maybe tapering methods, hyperbolic tapering strips, otherwise might apply in the case of a drug withdrawal problem, but not so much with drug damage. What are your thoughts on that?
Yeah, I think we can't draw a very clear line. For instance, people with PSSD may have the problem for 20 or 30 years afterwards, but what the PSSD community also report is they have windows. They can go on some drug, some other drug, like they can have an anesthetic called propofol to actually put them to sleep for some surgery, and they wake up and they're fine for maybe 2 or 3 months, and then the thing closes. And that's true of all the withdrawal problems also, which is, you have windows where you're doing quite well, and then all of a sudden things aren't going as well. So I mean, the PSSD stuff kind of suggests that what can look like damage isn't permanent damage, that there can be a recovery, and that's what keeps a lot of people on. It's what keeps me going, that we need to get a grip on what's going on here. And there's a bunch of different things that the serotonin system links into a bunch of piezo proteins. And my hunch, they're critically involved in the sensory receptors, touch receptors and things like that around the body, and pain and things like that. My hunch is that, it's something, I mean, it may well be, part of the problem may well be to do with piezo receptors. We just need to understand, they were only first identified 10 or 12 years ago. We need to find out, is there a way to turn whatever's been turned off back on again?
Yeah, absolutely. Thank you. And so you mentioned PSSD there. So Stephen asks, how would we approach treating, or I guess discussing PSSD with our doctors? And I guess there's a perennial problem of trying to deal with a doctor who has little or no knowledge of this area, is very resistant to the idea that drugs can be the cause of any harm whatsoever. So, are there any tips or tricks that people can use to get their doctor on side?
Yeah, and it's getting harder and harder. I think 30, 40 years ago, if you went along to a doctor and talked about a problem like that, they'd have been much more likely to believe you. The problem now is it's become the problem we all have is the drugs have become a religion. Now, if you're Irish, you know that what's involved here is the drugs have become sacraments. Doctors used to be told every drug is a poison, and the art of medicine is bringing good out of the use of a poison. So when things went wrong, they weren't awfully surprised. They're now told they're sacraments, which is a thing that can only do good. They just don't accept that it can do harm. It's this idea FDA wouldn't let it on the market if it could harm you. But, that's not FDA's job. The job is doctors working with you who may be harmed to recognize that it's a harm and to stand with you. If they don't stand with you, they're really failing in their job, and they're going out of business as a result.
Mm, mm, absolutely. And someone's asked, sorry, we're jumping around a bit here, David,
That's
but
okay. No problem.
can you speak specifically on how to manage the abject terror that is part of the drug dysregulation syndrome? And I guess, I've experienced this. I'm sure many people listening, it isn't just a physical phenomenon in your body. These issues come with a whole host of extremely powerful emotions and terror being one of them, particularly perhaps in relation to akathisia. So, I
Yeah.
wondered if you're in your dealings with risk reports, you've come across people who have got a handle on that somehow.
Well, I think a little bit is if we had a model, if you knew you were, as it were, going through the menopause, and
Mm.
this is going to last for a year or two, but it's going to clear up. Um, Coming back to things like, I think rather than talking about things and being told, well, this is actually all to do with the fact there's trauma in your past that you haven't dealt with. There may be, but you want to deal with it after you get the SSRI problems out of the way, and then you can have a look at it. But, you know, just brute repetition, doing things like walking or whatever can actually make a difference. And if you have a model, and this is where actually women in particular can help us, if you have a model like the menopause, that you can say, well, this is potentially going to go on for a year or two or whatever. There's going to be episodes where I think I'm going to die. It's the abject terror type thing, but I know that I'm not going to die. It's like a hot flash. I know what's going on. This is going to last for whatever period of time it lasts, but I'm going to survive it. It's not knowing what's going on and not knowing what's likely to happen makes all of these things worse. That's why we need some kind of a model which gives people a map as to what's actually going on, that they can say, well, yep, this is grim, but it is going to be over. Maybe a while, but it's going to be over.
Yep, thank you. And someone else has asked, David, in your opinion, do you think we should leave withdrawal problems and safety deprescribing to the lay community, or to try and get the mainstream educated enough to help us? And you've talked about, how pleased you are that people come forward and report these things, and that we are a community with experience. So, should this be a lay community-led initiative, or is there really any point in trying to get mainstream medicine on board with this?
Yeah, there's a few things here. One is um, I've taken lately when the media get in touch with me and they want me to talk about withdrawal and things like that, and they're going to say at the end of the program, look, don't do anything without consulting your doctor.
Yeah.
Okay. And I've taken to refusing to get involved in a program that's going to do that because I think consulting your doctor can be a disaster. Now, if you trust your doctor, that's great. But consulting your doctor can be an absolute disaster. And the media need to, they're there thinking, well, they don't know how to practice medicine. Legally, they're kind of obliged to say these things. The other angle on all this is that, and there's a few things I've learned lately that I wish I'd known years and years ago, but something I just learned today. There's people like Katinka Newman, and she's linked to a bunch of people over in France who've had an interesting kind of experience lately. And someone put it, I thought, quite well. They're interested in what suicide helplines say to people. People call them up and say, I'm feeling awful, terrible, and things like that. Now, among the common callers are people who've gone on an antidepressant, don't know what on earth is going on, and call the suicide helpline because they're having thoughts they've never had to handle before. But the people on the helpline, the lay people, are told they cannot ask about your pills, which are the likely cause. And they're told this because they're not medically qualified. The problem is if things like suicide helplines can't do the job, if they can't say anything about one of the commonest causes of people feeling suicidal out of the blue, should they be shut down? Are they doing any good? Are they making the problem worse? If you see what I mean. So, you know, uh, we have reached a bind. Things are getting progressively worse. And almost everything we think is a good idea, like trying to get people off too many meds, is being turned against us. People are now being whipped off benzodiazepines and whipped off SSRIs without having the chance to say, well, look, hey, wait a minute here, this could be awfully dangerous to me, and 4 weeks is not going to be the right period of time to get me off this drug, so we do have a big problem and a growing problem.
Yeah, absolutely. Thank you. And Someone's asked, I've taken SSRIs since they were invented 40 plus years now. I'm now 75. Is my body too old to handle getting off them? And I guess again, there's a whole slew of issues wrapped up here about, are there groups of people who will find the damage from drug dysregulation less, and are there a group of people that might find it more? What do we know from the kind of population affected?
Yeah, I think, well, I don't think we know. And even if we did know, sort of, I'm not in the business of getting moralistic. I'm not in the business of saying you should be taking therapy rather than pills, you should be off pills or whatever. Um, I think you do have more control of your life if you're off the pills, but there's a legitimate basis for some people to, just like there is for nicotine, there's some people who continue to take nicotine because it's anxiolytic and awfully effective. There's a legitimate basis for some people who've been on an SSRI and find it helps them and tones their personality down. They fit in easier with the people that they live with and things like that. It's not my place to say you really shouldn't be on them. I think we have to stop trying to convert people to the religion we believe in and work with what they want. They're living their lives, and my job is to help them live the life that they want to live, which may mean staying on the pills. And maybe there are things we can look at that will reduce the hazards, but saying you absolutely have to get off them or I'm not going to treat you from here on is just wrong.
Yeah, absolutely. Thank you. And another, it seems like Dr. Healy was suggesting that nicotine and alcohol are reasonable treatments for various forms of mental distress. I'm confused by the idea of substituting a potential addiction for psych drug dependence. That doesn't seem like an acceptable solution to me. Am I missing something?
Yeah, I think let me just take a slight detour here, and the implication here is that we shouldn't be using drugs; we should be using therapy. And apart from therapy, what gets left out is, maybe you should look at your diet and get fit and walk a lot and things like that. There's a bunch of things to be said for that. But when I talked about therapeutic principles, with the antidepressants, there's the serotonergic one, the norepinephrine, which is quite different, the mirtazapine, which is more like a tonic, and the tricyclics, which are a different kind of drug again. It may be the anticholinergic action that they have, that is, it's euphoriant, so that may be how they work. But just about a year ago, a friend said to me something that changed my mind about things completely. And I wish I'd heard it 40 years ago. He said, when Freud invented his therapy, and it's around the same time Jung invented his, and they were dealing with the same kind of thing, the same kind of approaches towards you. And Freud thought libido and things like that, and Jung thought, spirituality and things like that. And then we've got Aaron Beck comes along and talks about CBT, which doesn't work for me at all. Okay. Then there's DBT, which is Marshall Linehan, and IPT, which is Gerald Clerman. What my friend said to me was, Freud was solving his own problems. That didn't occur to me. What he creates is this universal sounding therapy, which everybody should have, but actually he was solving his problems, and Jung was solving his problems. They had a different approach. And Marcia Linehan, when she made DBT, was obviously solving her problems. And Gerald Clerman and Myrna Weissman, when they made IPT, well, they'd both broken up with their partners. So interpersonal therapy, they were solving their problems. And that's what you need to bear in mind. The therapies involve therapeutic principles as well, which may suit some people, but not others. And it's even the same for Buddhism. There's all different schools of Buddhism, which are based on different postures. I can't cross my legs in a lotus position, and there's loads of other people who can't. And different schools of Buddhism grew up around the position they thought was at the right position. So what people need to bear in mind is there's no universal answer to all these things. There's the thing that you find works for you. You don't want to be told by a book, this is the way you should do it. CBT for a while became this is the way people should do it. Well, it's never worked for me. I just, I can see the point behind it. I can see the logic, but it's just not me. So I think people need to remember that there are people solving their own problems with each of these therapies, and the task for each of us is to find the thing that suits us.
Yep. Yep. Thank you. I guess just to come back on that then, so I mean, quite a few people have asked, are there any natural remedies or supplements of any kind that you have come across in your kind of research that might help people struggling, or is it really just a case of what works for the individual?
Yeah, and I think one of the points, and again, I don't want to labor this too much.
Mm,
You've got a lot of effort put into getting people to take blood sugar lowering drugs, if they've got any hint of their blood sugar being raised. But if you look at this, you find that if you go on I mean, it sounds like you're getting control of your diabetes type 2 by going
mm,
on a pill. If you look at the stuff that goes with this, you find you get told that you can't go on a keto diet, you can't sort of go on a big diet that causes you to lose weight and things like that, because there's a risk that the combination of the pill and your efforts to lose weight and things like that could cause you to go hypoglycemic, which can cause you to dement.
mm,
Okay, so it's tricky. When you take a pill, you risk losing control. And this is true of antidepressants, antihypertensives, hypoglycemics, and virtually everything. You've got to weigh things up. And the pill can often feel like a quick fix. That's a little bit the problem.
mm.
Going on a diet, losing weight, getting fit, and things like that don't always sound like the easiest way to do it. But, you got to wonder whether maybe you get more control of your own life if you do it like that. Maybe with a bit of a pill or whatever, or a herb or natural supplement to help. When somebody asked about the natural supplement, I think one key point I get asked a lot, what's the best antidepressant or what's the best pill I should take? There is no such thing. There's the pill that will be helpful for you. And I guess that's true for natural supplements too. People rave about magnesium. I tried it once and it made me feel awful. So, it's what actually works for you is the thing that counts. And this is going to differ from each of us. There's no best supplement or best pill or best therapy. It's very much a case of trying to gauge what it is that's actually helping you.
Thank you. Thank you. And people may have seen it if they attended our last webinar. We had a
Hmm.
webinar a few weeks ago on neuroplasticity. So, a few people are asking for your thoughts on neuroplasticity.
Yeah, well, I've got a blog post on this, which is on the David Healy site, but it's linked into the text of this lecture. I give people a link to it and they can get my thoughts. I think part of what happens in neuroplasticity is old style behavior therapy.
Mm,
And it can be helpful for some of the problems linked to the pills, as I've outlined. But the default is when that doesn't work, people who talk about neuroplasticity tend to say, well, there's other stresses going on in your life, and there's maybe trauma in your past that you need to deal with in order for you to recover. And
mm,
that's the bit where I have a serious problem. I'm not saying that there isn't trauma and things like that that need to be dealt with at some point, but I am saying that, even completely, totally healthy volunteers can get serious SSRI dysregulations. And if you've got a serious SSRI dysregulation with all the emotional disturbances that go with that, you're not doing people a favor if you start talking about trauma that they need to deal with.
mm.
You need to get them through the SSRI problem and then let them decide for themselves if there's a trauma. We've all got trauma in our past, they have to decide for themselves whether it's a thing that needs to be dealt with. They should not be told by a person who knows nothing about SSRI dysregulation that they have to deal with their trauma now in order to get better.
Yeah. Yeah, absolutely. Thank you. And again, for those that follow Mad in America, a few weeks ago, a couple of weeks ago, we had an interview with Mark Horowitz and David Taylor, and I think Mark might be in the audience. If you are, so glad you're with us, Mark. Welcome. And during that day, David and Mark talked about the law of mass action. So, I wondered if you had thoughts on that and how that fits into this drug dysregulation model.
Yeah, it fits in awfully well going on the drugs. Now, what they've done where it doesn't fit is to say it also applies coming off the drugs, which, it's true for all drugs you can go on, the law of mass action, which is low doses of a drug have a much bigger effect than the extra bits that you then add on later. But coming off, that doesn't apply. If it did apply, we wouldn't be able to get off any drugs. And the thing is, the SSRIs, also the antipsychotics, but the SSRIs, really are in a league of their own compared with anticholinergics, beta blockers, antibiotics, this, that, and the other.
Great, thank you.
Also, one more extra point on that I just thought of. They're applying the law of mass action to binding to the serotonin side. But as I've hinted, SSRIs are carbonic anhydrase activators. And, we only know a fraction of what they do. They're antiviral, they're antibiotic, they may have anti-cancer actions as well. They act on primitive proteins like the p63 protein and the carbonic anhydrase enzymes. There's a ton of things going on with these drugs. I used to say every drug has at least 100 different actions, and the pharmaceutical industry only wants you to hear about one of them. In fact, when we look at it epigenetically, these drugs have something like 3,000 actions.
Yeah. Yeah, I'm always staggered when I see your talks, and you bring out so many different aspects of the effects of the drugs on the body. And when I read the lists in the official literature of dizziness or nausea or flu-like symptoms for a couple of weeks, then you'll be fine. It really doesn't do the
No,
experience
no.
justice in
Oh,
any way,
listen,
shape, or form.
what you and Mark and others, Peter Groot and all, you've been through misery. Peter Groot and the other tapering strips, he spent years trying to get off the drugs he was on. He's a real hero. Bob Biderman also, yeah, you guys have been pretty remarkable.
Thank you. So someone's asked, can the brain or body fully recover from the effects of long-term SSRI, SNRI use? And if so, are there ways to speed up the process? Which I guess is the kind of golden question, really, isn't it?
Yeah, well, I think what we need is some kind of model, as I said. And I think, again, we need to look at what women handling the menopause do. Do they do things like begin to run, go out and get fit and things like that? Are things like that which we haven't? I mean, the one thing they don't do is they don't go to therapy. They don't
Yeah.
think they've got a mental problem. Now, what we do a lot when we've got SSRI withdrawal problems, people seem to think they need to go into therapy. And it's not clear that that's going to speed things up. It may do just the opposite. There are therapies that can help, but they need to be very focused, and we need them to know that they are going to help. So, yeah, so I think we need a model, a map of what we're dealing with and how to get there. And then based on that, we may be able to work out how to speed the whole thing up.
Yeah, yeah, absolutely. Thank you. And during your talk, David, I was struck very much by the drug dysregulation model, and I started to wonder, you know, what our doctors might respond if we went in and talked about a drug injury or drug dysregulation problem rather than a withdrawal injury or a problem with an antidepressant. So, how can we start to sell this model to doctors so that we're not talking about withdrawal anymore because that was years ago. For some people, I'm still injured, I'm still damaged. It's a drug dysregulation problem or injury. How can we start to change the conversation, do you think?
Yeah, and that's the key question. And this is where we all need to be having a general conversation. You and all the others listening in, as opposed to me, are the people who've had to deal with doctors, and some of you have probably worked out ways to deal with doctors. So the key thing is to get a doctor you can trust, I guess, who will listen to you. What you've got to try and sell them is the idea that their life is going to be much more enjoyable if they're listening to you and working with you. People like you and Anne Marie and all do tons of research, and I get my name on the paper just for listening to you. It's a much better world. How you've got to give doctors, I guess, the feeling that it's a win for them also if
Yeah.
they listen to you.
Yeah. Yeah, absolutely. And again, several people have asked that, we've talked quite a lot about SSRI antidepressants today, but the kind of problems that you describe, the system-wide dysregulation that you've described, does that apply also to benzodiazepines, antipsychotics, perhaps other classes of psychiatric drug too?
Yeah, and it's not just the psychiatric drugs. One of the big things that risk has majored on is an antibiotic called doxycycline, which is used for acne. Now, there's also isotretinoin for acne and finasteride for hair loss, which cause the sexual problems that SSRIs cause and cause you to become suicidal as well. So, there's a ton of different drugs. Doxycycline can cause sexual problems. It can cause you to become suicidal. And it has the same effect as SSRIs on it acts on the serotonin system. It also acts on the carbonic anhydrase enzyme to cause the benign hypertension, glaucoma, and all these things. So yeah, there's much greater, like as I hinted, Prozac's an antibiotic as well. It will change your gut microbiome. People don't think about this. The marketing is so good, you see it just going straight to the brain and nowhere else. That's just not the case. There's huge overlap between all of the drugs we use. And it's not just the psychiatric drugs, but we are particularly good at causing problems using drugs that is hard to get off.
Absolutely. And I'd like to kind of ask about that directly, David. So, I can't speak for others, only myself, but maybe people out there will recognize this. Having had a really, really difficult experience myself with an antidepressant and with getting off it, I kind of came out of it thinking I never want to go near another pharmaceutical or non-pharmaceutical drug ever again. I really struggle even with taking ibuprofen or paracetamol if I've got a headache or whatever else. So, are you saying to people that they shouldn't be afraid of trying other substances to try and help manage a drug injury?
Yeah, no, you have to take the shit out of this. I'm outlining a bunch of things that I've heard from all of you.
Yeah.
Okay, the cetizolamide line that came off so much in the talk is things I've learned from listening to you. It's different people reporting that this drug has been helpful. I'm not saying this is what you should do. I'm letting people know about the things that the research that you're all doing is throwing up, and no one else is doing the research. It's people like you and everybody else who's on these pills who are doing the chasing and finding things out. I'm just letting you know about the things I've heard.
Yeah.
And so, in terms of, and this is going to be a much more important thing in the talk in 4 weeks' time. We're going to be talking about some very dark things in 4 weeks' time. And I have no idea what the answers to these things are, what the should is, and things like that. But I do know the people who are on these drugs are shedding more light about about the dark side of human nature than any of the priests or rabbis or imams or presidents or anything like that around the place. So, um, yeah, we need to have the conversations, and out of those conversations, we may all come to a better sense about what seem to be the better options.
Yep, great, thank you. We're kind of coming towards a close now, but just before we do, are there any books that you would particularly recommend people who, want a general understanding of the drugs and how they act and what the problems might be and so forth? Are there books that you'd recommend that people should look at, or maybe is there a good part of Risk that they should visit, or Mad in America too, I guess?
Yeah, well, I think the MIA posts are great. There's all sorts of posts on risk going back years, and I think there's a bunch of them that are great. There's a lot of posts written by people other than me. We've got a group of people behind the scenes who often write better than me and have made some of the written some of the breakthrough posts. So they're well worth reading. In terms of books, these things get written by doctors and experts and things like that. They haven't been doing the research. They're not up with the stuff we've talked about here this evening. So, you're not going to find much of that stuff in the books or the textbooks or even the scientific articles because journals won't publish the kind of stuff that we've been talking about. It's going to be somewhere like Mad in America or Risk or some other sites. Katinka Newman has a great site about antidepressant risks. That's one as well. That's the kind of place you're going to find these issues picked up.
Yeah.
And yeah.
Yep.
It's a
Yeah.
pity. I mean, it oughtn't to be that way, but that's the way it is.
Yeah, absolutely. And someone has asked, where should I share my story? And I'd echo that back to you and say, share it everywhere you can. Go on podcasts, write for Mad in America, write for Risk. Get every opportunity to, get the story out there of what's happened to you, and you will make connections with people that have been in similar positions, and we can build this critical mass of people who, as David says, are the real researchers in this work.
Hmm. Yep.
Great. Okay. Well, I think that's all the questions that we can get in. So I am so sorry if we didn't get to yours. Just in the
Well, there
last
will be
couple
an
of,
opportunity in 4 weeks' time for
yep,
some more of these questions to come up. And I mean, it is going to be a gripping conversation, I think.
I'm sure it will. And to all of you, thank you so much for being with us. Please show your appreciation for David in the chat and by reactions, and also for Zoe too for kind of running this event. As some of you may have missed it, but Bob Whitaker would have loved to be here today, but had to deal with a family issue that he couldn't get away from. So he does send his best wishes to you all. Please keep an eye on Mad in America for the dates of the next webinar in this series, where David will join us again. And thank you for all of your questions and all of your comments. We are thrilled that you could be with us. Please visit Mad in America and sign up for our newsletter. Follow us on social media. Maybe consider becoming a subscriber, because your input helps us put events like this on. So I hope you've enjoyed it today, and it's been a fascinating discussion that I will certainly think about long into the night, I'm sure, and possibly you too. So, David, any kind of final thoughts from you in the last couple of minutes?
No, no, just this. I mean, these are issues. I mean, I really mean it. From my point of view, this is a celebration of the things that people like you, James, have done, and the others who are tuning in here. If you go on Risk, you'll see again and again is people who have been on the pills, who, often get slapped down by the doctors that they go and see, but who turn out to be right.
Yeah. Yeah, absolutely. And just to reiterate, we will post the recording of this as soon as we can get it done. It will be in the next few days, the next week, and we'll share all the links that David mentioned. Yeah, I think that's kind of our time. So thank you so much to all of you for being with us.